Hello and welcome to Whispers of Earth, where wonder meets the night, and science gently guides us through the vast mysteries of existence. Tonight, we embark on a tranquil journey toward one of the most thought-provoking and mysterious questions we face, not just as curious minds, but as human beings contemplating our place beneath the stars. It's a question that has fascinated us all. What is guiding us, and what is the true nature of our connection to the cosmos? As the glaciers receded, the Earth was left a shadow of its former self, a barren landscape where only whispers of life remained. The world was colder than any had known before, but it wasn't just the temperature that had changed. The very soul of the planet had shifted, leaving behind scars that would take millennia to heal. The ice had ruled with brutal majesty, its frozen tendrils covering continents, erasing the traces of life and leaving behind an unforgiving world. But then the ice began to retreat, not with a dramatic roar, but a quiet sigh, as if it too had grown weary of its relentless grasp. Beneath the heavy weight of the glaciers, life had never truly disappeared. It had only been sleeping, waiting for the thaw, for the moment when the earth could once again breathe freely. The first signs of change were subtle. The air grew warmer, ever so slightly, just enough to stir the stillness. In the places where the glaciers had once reigned supreme, new shoots of life began to stretch from the soil. Grasses, small and fragile at first, pushed their way through the ice-melted earth, their tender green blades catching the weak light of a still-chilled sun. And from the edges of this new world, life slowly began to rise again. Mosses and lichens crept across the exposed rocks, painting them in shades of green and gold. These humble survivors were the first whispers of the recovery to come. They didn't need much, just the warmth of the sun, a bit of moisture, and time. In the silent aftermath of the Ice Age, they were the harbingers of a new world. The air began to feel different, too. The cold that had once stung the skin was now softer, gentler. The earth itself seemed to be awakening from a long, bitter sleep. And then, as if answering the call of the earth's revival, the great trees began to return. At first, only the hardiest species, those that could endure the still chilly temperatures, took root. Pines, birches, and firs, the evergreen warriors of the New World, stood tall, their roots clawing deep into the soil that had once been buried beneath layers of ice. Their branches reached toward the sky, as if in defiance of the frozen grip that had held the land for so long. But it wasn't just the plants that were returning. The animals, too, were making their way back. Slowly, they crept, moved, and galloped across the vast plains that had once been a lifeless tundra. Reindeer, musk oxen, and bison began to graze in the newly exposed fields, their hooves stirring up the soil, which had begun to soften with the warming climate. The rivers, swollen with meltwater, rushed through the land, carving new paths, bringing life to places that had been untouched for thousands of years. In the distance, a lonely mammoth, a symbol of the Ice Age's legacy, stumbled upon the thawed earth, its shaggy coat fluttering in the breeze. Though the great giants of the Ice Age had all but vanished, their memory lingered, and for a fleeting moment, it felt as if time had looped back upon itself. But the world had moved on. The mammoth, a creature built for cold, was soon joined by new species, creatures that had adapted to this warmer world, creatures that would fill the ecological void left behind. And so, the earth began its slow, quiet dance of recovery. The Ice Age, in all its brutal cold, had shaped this new world, but it was no longer in control. Life, fierce and fragile, was reclaiming its place, and with each passing day, the earth grew more vibrant, more alive. It was a world in the making, a world full of potential, teeming with life yet to be discovered. But for now, it was a world still taking its first breath. As the landscape began to reshape itself, there was a curious and powerful transformation happening beneath the surface, both in the land and in the hearts of the creatures who roamed it. The mighty giants of the past had left their imprint on the earth, and their absence left a void that needed to be filled. The world was no longer a frozen wasteland, but a wild, untamed realm where life was reclaiming its territory with intensity and passion. With the retreat of the ice, the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next chapter in its story. And then, in the deepening thaw, something extraordinary happened. New giants began to emerge, creatures that would come to dominate the plains, forests, and waters in the wake of the Ice Age's departure. The woolly mammoths, once the proud kings of the frozen steppe, had disappeared into the annals of history. Their massive bodies and thick coats no longer suited for the warming world. But nature, ever adaptive, began to reintroduce new forms of grandeur. The mammoth's absence created an opening, one that would be filled by new megafauna, creatures that would carry the legacy of the Ice Age in ways no one could have predicted. Bison, larger and fiercer than before, thundered across the plains, their powerful bodies designed to withstand the unpredictable climates that the thawing world now faced. Their hooves carved deep into the earth, creating trails that would later become highways for other migrating creatures. These herds were not simply survivors. They were the heart of the world's recovery, shaping the environment with their very presence. As the bison moved across the land, they were followed by the mighty reindeer, whose antlers, long and branching like the trees of the newly sprouted forests, became symbols of the world's resilience. These creatures, once bound by the cold, had evolved, their thick coats now giving way to sleeker, leaner bodies suited for the milder climate. They too were part of the dance, the great rhythm of life's return. But the change wasn't confined to the creatures of the plains. In the still wet forests, the mighty elk began to rise. Their horns, grand and towering, pierced the sky, creating silhouettes against the backdrop of the shifting earth. They moved with a sense of grace, their long legs carrying them through the underbrush of the newly formed woodlands. The forests, which had been nothing more than a distant dream during the Ice Age, now stood proudly, tall and alive with the hum of insect life and the call of birds. In the streams and rivers, a new kind of giant took root. The fish, once diminished by the freezing waters, thrived once again in the swelled rivers. Salmon, trout, and sturgeon filled the waters, their silvery scales reflecting the sunlight as they moved through the currents. The rivers themselves, shaped by the melting ice, became arteries of life, spreading nourishment across the land. Even the skies above, once eerily silent during the long reign of ice, began to echo with the calls of new birds. Migrating flocks of geese, ducks, and cranes made their way across the land, their wings carrying the story of the Earth's rejuvenation. With each wing beat, the world seemed to stir more deeply, as if the atmosphere itself was coming to life after a long and unforgiving winter. And within the shadows of the forests, where the light barely touched the forest floor, the new predators, sleek and powerful, began to make their mark. Wolves, more adaptable and cunning than before, began to form tighter packs. Their howls filled the air, a haunting reminder that the cycle of life and death had returned in full force. They were not the giants of the past, but they were no less important in the delicate balance of the ecosystem. The great cats, lynxes and cougars, padded silently through the underbrush, their muscles coiled and ready to strike. Their silent movements were a testament to the quiet power they held over the land. These hunters had adapted, evolved, and now ruled a world that was becoming increasingly complex and interconnected. The Ice Age's era of giant predators was over, but these new hunters were making their own mark in the world of the thaw. Life in all its forms was finding its way back, and with it came the Earth's slow but certain reawakening. Every blade of grass that poked through the soil, every creature that took its first steps in this new world, was a victory over the cold, over the stillness, and over the waiting silence of the ice. The reawakening of the Earth after the Ice Age was nothing short of magical, a slow, almost imperceptible transformation, like the unfurling of a long dormant flower. The climate, though still erratic, gradually warmed, ushering in a season of growth that had once seemed impossible under the weight of the ice. The land was no longer bound by the harshness of the cold, but neither was it yet the gentle, predictable world we know today. It was wild and untamed, a land of contrasts, where life and death danced in the most primal of rhythms. The newly formed rivers, swollen with meltwater, rushed through valleys that had once been buried beneath glaciers, carving new paths and spreading life in every direction. These rivers were not just bodies of water. They were the veins of the world, bringing nourishment to the land and offering a highway for both creatures and plants alike. The plants were the first to take advantage of this abundance. Where once the land had been stark and barren, now delicate wildflowers began to sprout, their colors vivid against the dark soil. In the wetlands, reeds and grasses began to reclaim the edges of the rivers, their green shoots bending and swaying in the wind like a living curtain, welcoming in new wildlife. Where the rivers met the sea, the land was constantly shifting, a boundary between two worlds. Coastal plains, once submerged beneath the ice, were now revealed, creating new ecosystems. The sea, too, had begun to change, its levels rising as the glaciers retreated. New shorelines formed, creating rich feeding grounds for shorebirds and marine life. Salt marshes bloomed with life, supporting not only the plants and animals that thrived in the brackish waters, but also providing a nursery for new species yet to come. The earth was slowly reintroducing its animals to the recovering landscapes. While the large mammalian giants had mostly disappeared, their legacy lived on in the smaller creatures that filled the void. The resurgence of herbivores, like the bison and the reindeer, was just the beginning. Predators, too, began to return. But these predators were no longer the large, terrifying beasts that once ruled the Ice Age. The wolves, in their packs, began to hunt the herds of bison that now dominated the plains. Their howls echoed through the forests, a haunting melody in a world that had once been silent. In the shadows of the forests, the smaller predators, foxes, lynxes, and wildcats, crept through the underbrush, their sharp eyes ever watchful. They too were part of the new balance. They hunted not with the brute force of their Ice Age ancestors, but with speed and agility, mastering the art of survival in a world that was becoming more complex, more interconnected. They were part of a new ecosystem that was finding its rhythm, a delicate symphony of life in which every creature, from the smallest insect to the mightiest predator, had a role to play. And in the skies above, the birds, those first messengers of spring, flitted through the air. Their songs became more varied, more complex as the land around them grew more diverse. The song of life, it seemed, was returning. The earth, in all its complexity, was coming back to life, not in the grand, sweeping ways that one might expect, but in the small, quiet movements of nature. As the earth began its revival, a delicate balance between life and death took shape, intricately woven into the tapestry of the newly warmed world. The Ice Age may have been over, but its legacy, both in terms of its dramatic transformations and its surviving species, lived on in the way the land itself began to pulse with life. Yet, with life returning, the old rhythm of the hunt, of predators and prey re-emerged, slowly at first, but inevitably. The bison herds, their hooves thundering across the plains, were the very essence of strength and endurance. They moved in vast, undulating waves, grazing in the wild expanses that had once been the domain of mammoths and mastodons. But in this new world, there was a shift. Their world had grown smaller, more fragile, as the forces of climate change and human encroachment began to shape their lives. Predators, once scarce, now stalked the herds, waiting for a moment of weakness. The wolves, as agile and relentless as ever, prowled the peripheries of the herds, waiting for the right moment to strike. They had learned the dance of patience, tracking the herd, working together, communicating in hushed whispers of howls and movements. It wasn't a battle of strength, but of strategy, cooperation, and timing. When the pack finally moved in, it was swift and decisive. The herd, though formidable, was often caught off guard, with a lone bison separated from the safety of its group, a vulnerable target. The chase was not only a fight for food, but a reminder that in the world of life's resurgence, there could be no easy victory. Yet even the wolves were not immune to the cycle of life and death. Just as the bison faced predators, so too did the wolves meet their end in the form of hunger, injury, or rival packs. This was nature's design, a balance that would continue to echo throughout the land. Every death in the wild, no matter how seemingly tragic, was a gift to the land, enriching the soil, feeding the plants, and allowing the cycle to begin anew. The role of scavengers became more pronounced in this intricate web. Vultures circled high above, their keen eyes scanning the plains for signs of weakness. Their screeches filled the air, a reminder that the world was not simply about predators and prey, but of transformation and decomposition. Every carcass, every fragment of the once mighty creatures became sustenance for the next generation. And beneath the earth, insects and worms burrowed deep into the soil, breaking down the remnants of the dead and turning them into life-sustaining nutrients for the plants that covered the land. In the forests, the balance of life was no less complex. The deer and smaller herbivores grazed on the young shrubs and trees, keeping the forest clear, allowing the undergrowth to flourish. Yet their survival was constantly at risk. The lynxes, now a part of the thriving woodland ecosystem, were agile hunters, slipping through the shadows with deadly silence. Their sharp claws and swift movements were enough to bring down a young deer or even an unlucky rabbit. But in the stillness of the forest, their own survival was a constant challenge. Survival in a world that was only beginning to form its rhythm of death and life. Above, the birds of prey, hawks, eagles, and owls swooped down with precision, their talons slicing through the air to catch their quarry. Their wings beat with the power of ancient instincts, and in their hunting, they too played a vital role in maintaining the balance of the ecosystem. Without these predators, smaller creatures would overrun the land, disturbing the delicate harmony that had begun to establish itself in the wake of the Ice Age. In the water, the larger fish swam deep, their scales glistening in the fading sunlight, their eyes ever watchful for smaller creatures. The river's currents were swift and alive with the movement of both predator and prey, a dance that had existed long before the ice ever reached the earth. The fish, their fins cutting through the water like whispers in the wind, mirrored the eternal rhythm of life's return. Amid the growing rush of life across the planet, there were those who worked unseen, quietly and steadily, to shape the world in ways that would last far beyond their time. These were not the great predators or towering giants, but the silent architects, the plants, fungi, and microorganisms that lay the foundation for all other life. They worked beneath the surface, in the shadows of the towering trees, and across the expanse of the vast plains. It was in the soil where the magic truly began. As the land softened, new roots dug deep, reaching into the earth that had long been barren. Grasses, wildflowers, and shrubs, so simple yet essential, began to spread across the newly thawed land. Their roots worked tirelessly, breaking up the soil, helping to create a fertile foundation for other plants and trees to take root. The grasses, swaying gently in the wind, became a lifeline for herbivores that grazed on their tender shoots. They were the first to greet the returning animals, offering sustenance and hope for a world that was slowly turning green again. But it wasn't just the visible plants that were the architects of the new world. Beneath the surface, an unseen kingdom of fungi and microbes worked in silent collaboration. Fungi broke down the decaying matter left in the wake of the Ice Age, turning it into life-giving nutrients. They were the recyclers of the earth, decomposing the once mighty giants that had fallen to predators or the passing of time. Without them, the land would be choked by the remnants of the past, unable to support the thriving ecosystems that were beginning to take shape. In the forests, the trees began to rise like the pillars of a new world. First, the hardy pioneers, birches, pines, and willows, pushed their way into the soil, their roots spreading far and wide, creating networks that would support a future forest. The trees not only offered shelter to the creatures that would one day live among them, but began the process of cooling the land, their shade making the ground below more hospitable to other plants and animals. The tall trunks of these trees stretched toward the sky, creating a canopy that would eventually support entire ecosystems of birds, insects, and smaller mammals. The bees, butterflies, and other pollinators, in turn, began their delicate work. They carried the pollen from plant to plant, ensuring the continuation of new species. As the flowers bloomed and ripened into seeds, they attracted not only the creatures of the air, but those on the ground. The animals, drawn to the lush vegetation, began to interact with the environment in ways that were more intertwined than before. In the vast plains, the grasses that had first broken through the soil now covered the earth in dense patches, offering shelter to small rodents and insects. These creatures, in turn, fed the larger animals, the foxes, hawks, and other predators, who stalked the land, playing their role in the balance of the ecosystem. The rhythm of life was returning, and with it, the architecture of the planet was being built from the ground up. As life flourished, so too did the earth's breath, the wind, the rain, and the sun. Each element played its part in the grand symphony of the planet's recovery, slowly but surely transforming a once bleak landscape into a vibrant and teeming world. Nature, in its quiet wisdom, had begun to find balance again, threading together the land, the creatures, and the elements. The wind carried seeds, dust, and pollen across the land, touching every corner with its invisible fingers. It played an essential role in the spread of plant life, moving seeds from one fertile ground to another, ensuring that no corner of the earth would remain barren. The wind, once a harsh force, now acted as a gentle carrier of life, swirling through the branches of newly formed trees, through the tall grasses of the plains, and across the still cool lakes that reflected the softening sky. Rain, too, became a life-giver. What was once an arid land, stripped of moisture by the cold, was now receiving the life-giving water it so desperately needed. The skies opened up with more frequency, letting the rain fall gently upon the land. This rainfall nourished the soil, encouraging the rapid growth of plant life, filling the rivers and lakes, and ensuring that the earth would continue to thrive. The rain, though soft and at times fleeting, became the lifeblood of the world's ecosystems. Rivers swollen with rainwater began to carve deeper into the land, sculpting valleys and floodplains, transforming the earth into a new landscape. The sun, too, took on a different role in this new world. It bathed the planet with warmth, bringing the necessary heat to awaken the earth after its long, icy slumber. The once frozen ground, which had long been held under a cold, cruel grip, now began to soften and warm under the sun's rays. In turn, this heat caused the cycles of life to resume, plants growing toward the light, animals seeking shelter in the shade, and the earth itself taking its place as a vibrant and alive entity. But the earth's breath wasn't just about life, it was also about change. The warming of the climate was creating shifts that would soon reshape entire ecosystems. The forests, which had sprung up from the land's initial recovery, began to spread further, slowly pushing northward. The great grasses of the plains, once dominant in the harsh cold, found themselves giving way to new growth as the earth heated and rains fell more regularly. The change was subtle, but it was unmistakable, a quiet shift in the planet's composition. The ecosystems that had once been locked into a harsh and unchanging cycle during the Ice Age were now starting to evolve, adapting to the changes brought on by the retreat of the glaciers and the warming climate. While the Earth had faced unimaginable cold, it was now experiencing a thaw of opportunity, a chance for all living things to adjust, evolve, and find new ways of survival. Yet even with this newfound warmth and prosperity, the Earth's recovery was far from guaranteed. The world was still fragile, still adjusting to the many changes taking place. But in the stillness of the early mornings, when the sun rose over the plains, casting a soft glow on the dew-covered grasses, it was clear. The earth had begun to breathe again, and it would never be the same. As the earth began to breathe and grow anew, there were still lingering shadows from the past, silent reminders of the long reign of ice that once governed the land. In the thick forests, the rivers, and across the wide open plains, remnants of the Ice Age's massive power and influence could still be seen in the scars it left behind. These marks on the earth were not merely physical. They were the memory of the land itself, a memory of the cold, unyielding grip that had once suffocated all life. The glaciers, though retreating, had left deep grooves and valleys in their wake. These U-shaped valleys, carved by the slow, grinding movement of ice, remained as silent witnesses to the era of ice. They were the Earth's way of remembering, a stark contrast to the now softened landscape that had begun to flourish. These valleys, filled with lakes and rivers, served as a reminder of how the land had been shaped and molded by the relentless force of the glaciers. Across the plains, massive boulders, too large to have been moved by any means other than the ice, lay scattered like forgotten monuments. These glacial erratics were reminders that the earth had once been so cold that even the land beneath it had been swept away. Now they stood as silent witnesses, like ancient guardians, keeping watch over the new world that had risen in the wake of the cold. Though life had returned, these stones, pushed across great distances by the advancing ice, held the imprint of the past, still heavy, still unmoved. In the forests, the memory of the Ice Age's weight could be found in the stunted trees and the jagged edges of rocks, worn down by the centuries of ice. The trees, though beginning to grow tall and strong, had to push their roots through the soil that had been compacted and hardened by ice. The land was still recovering from the weight of that frozen epoch, and some places would take longer to heal than others. Yet even with the reminders of the past looming over the landscape, the world around them had begun to change in ways that could not be ignored. New species of plants, more suited to the warming world, began to thrive. As the forests spread further north, more species found their way to the land that had once been a barren wasteland. The returning trees not only provided shelter for the animals, but they began to shape the soil in ways that the grasslands could never have done. Small mammals, birds, and insects began to return to the land that had once been too cold to sustain them. Their movements in the underbrush and through the branches of trees helped break down the once frozen soil, enriching it with organic matter. As these creatures scurried and buzzed through the land, they too became part of the recovery, quietly working alongside the plants to create the delicate balance of life that had been lost for so long. Even the predators, though now fewer in number, still carried the echoes of the Ice Age with them. Wolves, foxes, and lynxes stalked the forests and plains, their presence marking the land as one where life and death played out daily. These hunters, though smaller and less imposing than the giants of the past, carried with them the sharp instincts and adaptability that had once helped their ancestors survive the cold. The presence of these predators was essential to maintaining the balance of the ecosystem, controlling the populations of the herbivores that had become so abundant. In the water, the creatures that had once struggled in the cold depths now found their home in warmer, more fertile waters. Fish, amphibians, and insects began to thrive in the rivers and lakes, which were teeming with life once more. The riverbanks, which had been nothing but a frozen wasteland, now hosted lush vegetation and an abundance of animals that relied on the water for survival. The shadows of the past remained, but they no longer held dominion over the earth. The land was not defined by the ice that had once gripped it, but by the life that had returned in its place. Though the land bore the scars of the past, it was the future that was now being shaped by those who roamed it, those who breathed in its air, and those who found their place in this new world. The earth had found its rhythm again, slow, steady, and full of life. In the quiet, evolving world after the Ice Age, the cycle of renewal was relentless. With each passing season, the land seemed to pulse with life. Birth, growth, decay, and rebirth, all unfolding in a never-ending loop. It was a cycle that stretched back eons, yet felt fresh in the stillness of this new world, where every leaf seemed to breathe, and every creature moved with purpose. The plants, ever the quiet workers of the earth, continued to spread and weave their way through the recovering land. Grasses tall and thick swayed in the wind, their seeds carried far and wide by the ever-present breeze. The warmth of the sun, now stronger and more consistent, bathed the plains, forests, and wetlands, allowing life to burst forth in vibrant hues. Wildflowers in shades of purple, yellow, and red dotted the landscape, adding color to the once barren soil. These tiny, fragile blooms were the epitome of life's resilience, proof that even after the harshest winters, the earth could still heal and begin again. But as life bloomed, the predators were never far behind. Wolves, swift and silent, prowled the underbrush, watching the herds of herbivores that grazed upon the tender grasses. The prey animals, too, had adapted to the changing world. They had learned to move with the seasons, following the food and shelter that appeared in different corners of the land. Reindeer and bison herds now moved in great migrations, their numbers swelling and ebbing with the rhythms of the earth. The vast open plains, once harsh and cold, had become a haven for these herds, and with them, the land itself began to thrive. In the water, life flourished with similar vigor. Rivers that once flowed sluggishly under the weight of ice were now alive with activity. Fish swam freely, darting through the flowing currents, while the waters of lakes, once choked by cold and ice, became rich with nutrients. The riverbanks were lined with lush vegetation, offering shelter and sustenance to countless animals. The once empty waters had transformed into vital lifelines for all manner of creatures, from the smallest amphibians to the majestic waterfowl that soared above. However, it was not only the visible creatures that made up the intricate web of life. Beneath the soil, unseen forces continued their work. Fungi spread their networks through the damp earth, breaking down organic matter and enriching the soil. The quiet decay of dead plants and animals, once the silent legacy of the past, now fueled the next generation of growth. These microscopic and fungal architects played a crucial role in the recovery of the planet, turning the remnants of the past into the very foundation for the future. The skies, too, had become a stage for life's dance. Birds, both migratory and permanent, filled the air with their calls. Their wings beat in the wind, their songs signaling the ever-changing rhythm of the earth. The forests, once silent in their cold state, were now alive with the chirps and calls of countless creatures: woodpeckers tapping at the trunks of trees, owls hooting in the dusk, and the faint rustle of wings through the leaves. The air itself seemed to hum with life, the earth's breath now soft and constant. Each of these creatures, whether predator or prey, whether rooted to the earth or soaring above, had a place in this cycle, a place that was critical for the health of the entire system. The earth had not only healed from the harsh cold, but it was now learning to thrive in the warmth, constantly adapting to the ever-changing environment. The recovery of Earth after the Ice Age was not just a return of life, but the beginning of a complex web, intricately woven, where every thread, no matter how small, contributed to the larger picture. The land, now alive with plants and animals, was constantly shifting and changing, each organism playing its role in the delicate balance that kept the cycle of life moving forward. At the heart of this intricate web were the ecosystems that began to take root in the newly warmed world. Forests, grasslands, wetlands, and rivers. Each of these habitats was a living entity, bound together by the actions of the creatures that inhabited them. The trees that had sprouted in the northern regions were no longer isolated. Now they formed vast, dense forests, stretching as far as the eye could see. In these forests, the rhythm of life was pulsing at full force. The ground was teeming with life. Mice, rabbits, and insects that skittered through the underbrush, providing food for the birds of prey that soared above. But it wasn't just the land creatures that played their part. In the waters, new life was unfolding in ways that had not been seen for thousands of years. The rivers, once sluggish under the weight of ice, now ran freely, their currents carving deep paths through the earth. Fish of all kinds swam through the waters, from the tiny minnows darting in the shallows to the larger fish that glided gracefully in the deeper currents. These fish, in turn, supported the life of the predators, bears, otters, and eagles, that relied on them for food. In the wetlands, the air was thick with the hum of insects, mosquitoes, dragonflies, and beetles that flitted among the tall reeds and grasses. These insects, though small, played a massive role in pollinating the plants, ensuring the continued growth of vegetation. The small mammals and birds that lived in these areas relied on the dense, green vegetation for shelter and food, while larger predators, like the wolves and foxes, often hunted the smaller creatures that called the wetlands home. The plant life, too, had become far more diverse. Where once there were only sparse grasses and low shrubs, now thick forests of pine, birch, and oak were thriving. These trees offered shelter to the birds and mammals that lived among their branches, while their roots helped to keep the soil from eroding. As the trees grew taller and denser, they began to create a canopy that blocked the sun from reaching the forest floor, allowing for the growth of mosses and ferns beneath. This layering of life created a habitat rich with variety, offering space for countless species to thrive. Even the weather played its part in the Earth's recovery. The steady rainfall that nourished the forests also ensured that the plains stayed lush and green. The change in temperature, though subtle at first, had transformed the climate of the once barren lands. The warmth and moisture allowed for a steady cycle of growth and decay, which in turn allowed for the constant renewal of the planet's ecosystems. The Earth's breath had changed from the cold, dry winds of the Ice Age to warm, moist breezes that carried the scent of life in every direction. This was a world in constant motion, a world where every creature, every plant, and every drop of water contributed to the greater whole. The Earth was not just recovering from the Ice Age, it was flourishing in ways that no one could have imagined in the depths of winter. This was the pulse of life, strong, vibrant, and intertwined. While the world around them bloomed with new life, another, quieter force was at work: evolution. The return of ecosystems and the shifting climate created the perfect conditions for species to adapt, evolve, and flourish in this newly warming world. What once seemed like a static landscape now revealed itself as a dynamic, living entity, constantly shifting and reshaping itself in response to the needs of the creatures that called it home. In the forests, the animals had already begun to adapt to their new environment. The once sturdy herds of mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses had vanished, leaving behind smaller but equally formidable creatures. The reindeer, whose ancestors had roamed the frozen plains, now found themselves evolving to survive in a warmer climate. Their thick, shaggy coats began to thin, replaced by lighter, sleeker fur that allowed them to move more easily through the now denser forests. These creatures, once built for the cold, had found a way to adapt to the changing world. They had learned to survive, not by brute strength, but by evolving with the land around them. The wolves, too, had adapted. In the deepening forests, where once the vast plains had stretched before them, they learned to work in smaller, more coordinated packs. Their hunting strategies, once reliant on chasing down vast herds, now focused on stalking and ambushing smaller prey, blending into the shadows of the trees and using their keen senses to track the movements of their prey. Their sharp teeth, built for tearing through thick hides, now served them in a different way, cutting through the softer flesh of smaller animals, moving with the rhythm of the forest rather than the wide-open plains. In the grasslands, the bison, once the giants of the plains, found themselves in a rapidly changing environment. As the grasses that once dominated the land gave way to more diverse vegetation, the bison adapted, learning to graze on the new plants that had sprung up in the aftermath of the Ice Age. Their thick hides, once a defense against the biting cold, were now suited to the heat of the warming world. They had survived the long frozen nights, and now they were thriving in the warmth of a new, rapidly changing landscape. Even the smallest creatures, those that scurried through the underbrush or fluttered through the air, had begun to evolve to meet the demands of the changing world. Insects, once stunted by the cold, now flourished in the new conditions, their populations growing rapidly. These tiny creatures, though often overlooked, played an essential role in the recovery of the planet. They pollinated the flowers, spread seeds, and helped break down organic matter, providing the nutrients that plants and trees needed to grow. Above the forests and across the plains, the birds had begun their own dance of adaptation. Their songs, once a sporadic whisper in the cold winds of winter, now filled the air with the sound of life. The birds that once migrated to avoid the freezing temperatures had now settled in, finding their place in the warming world. Their feathers grew brighter, their calls more varied as they adapted to the ever-changing landscape. In this world of change, nothing was static. The earth, though still carrying the scars of the Ice Age, had become a living testament to life's resilience and adaptability. Evolution, though a quiet force, was as relentless as the seasons themselves. It shaped the creatures that walked, flew, and crawled upon the earth, ensuring that life would continue, no matter the challenge. The earth was not just recovering, it was transforming, creating new forms of life that would rise in the wake of the Ice Age and carry the planet forward into a new era. As the Earth's ecosystems continued to evolve and flourish, something extraordinary began to happen. An awakening of the giants, albeit in a new form. The great creatures that had roamed the land during the Ice Age had all but vanished, their size and strength no longer suited to the warming world. But from their legacy, new giants emerged, different in shape, purpose, and role. These new creatures weren't just massive in size, they were monumental in their importance to the ecosystems that were now taking root. The bison, descendants of the mammoths and other Ice Age giants, were now the towering creatures of the plains. Their herds, once only small groups, had grown larger, their presence commanding the vast, open spaces of the grasslands. These modern-day giants were now the true rulers of the plains, their massive bodies creating trails that would later be followed by other animals. Their grazing helped maintain the delicate balance of the ecosystem, preventing the encroachment of trees and shrubs, and allowing grasses to thrive. They were the unwitting gardeners of the land, sculpting the landscape with every step they took. In the forests, the mighty moose, whose antlers seemed to reach toward the sky, had become the new monarchs of the woodlands. Their towering bodies navigated through the trees, feeding on the soft vegetation that had begun to reclaim the land. Their large hooves crushed the underbrush, helping to keep the forest floor clear, allowing for new plants to take root. The moose, though not as numerous as the bison, were no less important to the structure of the forest. They were the keepers of the woods, helping to shape the environment through their movement and grazing habits. The predators, too, had found their place in this world of renewal. Wolves, coyotes, and bears had adapted their hunting techniques to the shifting landscape. No longer were they simply chasing down vast herds. Now they hunted smaller, more agile prey. The wolves, ever the masters of teamwork, formed tighter packs, using strategy and patience to bring down their quarry. Their howls, once echoing across the frozen tundra, now resonated in the forests, their call a symbol of the changing times. But perhaps the most awe-inspiring of the new giants were the whales and other sea creatures that now ruled the oceans. With the melting ice, the seas had risen, and the once cold and barren waters were now rich with life. Whales, with their massive bodies and graceful movements, became the giants of the deep. Their migration patterns, once dictated by the harsh cold, were now influenced by the warming waters and the abundance of food that the oceans offered. They traversed the seas, feeding on the rich plankton and krill that thrived in the newly temperate waters, shaping the health of the oceans and the creatures that lived within them. In the skies, the great birds of prey, like eagles and condors, had become the giants of the air. Their wings spread wide. They soared across the skies, their keen eyes scanning the ground below. These birds, once few and far between during the colder days, now ruled the skies. Their sharp talons and powerful beaks made them apex predators, ensuring the balance of the land below by keeping smaller populations in check. These giants, though different from those that once roamed the earth during the Ice Age, were no less important. They had inherited the mantle of the great creatures that had once walked the land, taking on new roles and responsibilities in this shifting world. As they moved across the land, the forests, the plains, and the oceans, they helped to shape the world in their image, ensuring that life would continue to thrive in all its forms. As the giants of the land, sky, and sea continued their reign in the recovering world, the true heartbeat of the earth could be felt through the smallest of creatures. These seemingly insignificant life forms were, in fact, the unseen force that held the ecosystems together. Without them, the world would falter, and the delicate balance that had been painstakingly rebuilt would collapse. The smallest, often overlooked creatures were the pulse of life, the insects, the microbes, and the plants that created the foundation of the food web. In the forests, the hum of bees and the flutter of butterflies became more prominent with each passing season. These tiny pollinators moved from flower to flower, spreading life in ways that were invisible but no less essential. Without their tireless efforts, the flowers that dotted the landscape would not bloom, and the trees, whose fruit and seeds fed countless animals, would not bear their bounty. The bees were not merely workers, they were the architects of the future. They ensured that plants could reproduce, that fruits would ripen, and that new life would emerge in the following spring. Beneath the soil, the real work of renewal was taking place. Earthworms, ants, and other tiny creatures worked endlessly, breaking down organic matter and enriching the soil. They were the unseen engineers of the land, aerating the soil with their movements, turning dead plant material into fertile ground. The soil itself, once a hard, frozen shell, had softened and become a fertile bed for new growth. The presence of these small creatures, silently tunneling and feeding, ensured that the earth was alive and breathing from the ground up. In the wetlands, dragonflies and mosquitoes skimmed the surface of the still waters, feeding on smaller insects and larvae. These creatures, though seemingly insignificant, had a massive impact on the ecosystem. They provided food for birds, frogs, and larger predators, while also keeping the insect populations in check. Their role in controlling populations ensured that no one species would overwhelm the landscape, maintaining the delicate balance of the food web. The predators who had once dominated the land and waters relied heavily on these small creatures. Without the ants, the worms, and the bees, the larger predators would have found the land barren, their food sources scarce. The wolves, foxes, and hawks that hunted the plains and forests depended on the insects and rodents that scurried below, feeding on the fruits of the trees and grasses that grew from the fertile soil. The entire system was a web, with each creature, from the smallest microbe to the largest mammal, playing an essential role. In the oceans, the plankton and krill were the lifeblood of marine life. These tiny organisms floated in the currents, feeding on the nutrients carried by the melting ice. They, too, were the foundation upon which the entire oceanic ecosystem rested. Whales, dolphins, and fish depended on the plankton, creating a cycle of life that stretched across the vast waters of the earth. The smallest creatures in the ocean, often invisible to the naked eye, were the pulse of the seas. Above it all, the air was filled with the songs of birds, the chirping of insects, and the rustling of trees in the wind. The earth, in all its complex beauty, was alive, not just in the grand movements of the predators or the growth of towering trees, but in the smallest actions, the flutter of wings, the scurry of paws, the shift of soil. These small but powerful forces were the heartbeat of the earth, ensuring that the world would continue to thrive in a cycle that would go on for millennia. In this newly awakened world, there was an undeniable force that continued to shape the land, a force that was wild, untamed, and primal, the wild itself. The earth, though healing from the cold, was still a place of raw power, where life fought to survive in the face of change. The forces of nature, unpredictable and ever-shifting, ruled the land just as much as the creatures that roamed it. The forests, teeming with life, had begun to form their own rhythm, one that was dictated not by the order of human hands, but by the instinctual patterns of the wild. The trees, once stunted and sparse, had grown tall and thick, their branches intertwining to form canopies that filtered the sun's rays. Beneath them, the underbrush grew dense, thick with ferns and shrubs, creating a maze of green for the creatures that made their homes there. In the shadows, predators moved silently, their sharp eyes watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. The forests were alive with the sounds of life, from the rustling of small animals in the underbrush to the calls of birds perched high in the trees. Squirrels darted from branch to branch, gathering nuts and seeds, while deer cautiously moved through the dense undergrowth. Their presence, though quiet, was part of the rhythm of the wild. They were the prey that kept the predators sharp, the food source that supported the wolves, lynxes, and bobcats that prowled the forest floor. These predators, though smaller and more agile than the giants of the past, had learned to survive through stealth and skill. They blended into the landscape, becoming one with the shadows, and when they moved, it was with a precision that made them masters of the hunt. In the plains, the wild had taken on a different form. The bison herds, once grazing in small, scattered groups, had grown into vast, undulating masses, stretching as far as the eye could see. The ground trembled beneath their hooves as they moved together in perfect synchrony, their sheer numbers overwhelming the land. The herds were the heartbeat of the plains, and their movements dictated the flow of life across the landscape. They were the great wanderers, moving from one patch of grass to the next, grazing on the endless sea of green that stretched before them. But even the bison were not safe in this wild world. The wolves, who had learned the art of hunting in packs, now stalked the herds with a cunning precision. Their strategy was simple, yet deadly: divide and conquer. The wolves would wait until the herd became fragmented, and then, with a sudden burst of speed, they would isolate a young or weaker member from the group. The chase was swift, brutal, and relentless, but it was part of the balance, the law of nature, where survival depended on the ability to adapt and hunt. Above the plains, the sky was filled with the calls of vultures and eagles, their sharp eyes scanning the land below. They were the scavengers, cleaning up what the predators had left behind. They swooped down upon carcasses, their wings stretching wide as they glided effortlessly through the air. Their work was vital, for without them, the remnants of death would litter the land, creating a cycle of decay that would hinder the growth of new life. The wild, though harsh and unforgiving, was the true keeper of the earth's balance. It was a world in constant motion, where life thrived on the edge of survival, where the strong thrived, and the weak were cast aside. Yet, in that very struggle, life found its true power. It was the wild that had always ruled the earth, and it was the wild that would continue to shape the world for millennia to come. With each passing season, the earth's recovery continued to unfold, and the rhythm of life shifted ever so slightly. The changes were subtle at first: an extra blossom here, a longer migration there, but they were undeniable. The planet was becoming a different place, shaped by forces both ancient and new. The Ice Age, with its cold grip and silent rule, was receding into the past, leaving behind a world where warmth and life now ruled. The warming climate, though welcome, brought its own challenges. Where the snow had once blanketed the land, temperate forests and grasslands were now emerging. The world, once defined by extremes, was finding balance in its own way. The plants that had first broken through the cold earth were now finding themselves in competition with new species, those better suited for the warmer, wetter environment. The once vast plains of tundra, with their short grasses and stunted shrubs, were slowly giving way to thicker, more diverse vegetation, and with it, the dynamic of the land was shifting. In the forests, the once stagnant soil enriched by the decaying bodies of ancient plants and animals, now came to life with new species of trees, bushes, and flowers. Oaks and maples began to thrive, their leaves casting shade on the forest floor and providing shelter for countless creatures. Beneath the towering trees, smaller plants, ferns, shrubs, and wildflowers spread across the ground, creating a layered ecosystem. These new plants helped sustain the herbivores that depended on their leaves, seeds, and berries, while their roots further enriched the soil, ensuring the ongoing health of the ecosystem. The shift in vegetation also brought new predators into the mix. With the increasing abundance of smaller mammals, birds of prey began to make their return. Hawks, owls, and eagles once again filled the skies, their sharp eyes scanning the earth below for signs of movement. The predators, whether soaring above or stalking through the underbrush, were part of the delicate dance of life, their presence ensuring that no one species could dominate the land. They helped maintain the balance of the ecosystem, regulating the populations of herbivores and keeping the forests from being overrun. Meanwhile, in the plains, the bison continued to roam, their herds moving in synchronized patterns that seemed to follow an ancient rhythm. Their grazing was crucial in maintaining the grasslands, preventing the growth of shrubs and trees that could change the ecosystem entirely. In turn, the bison provided sustenance for predators, from wolves to mountain lions, who relied on their size and strength to take down prey. Even as the world warmed, the great migration of the bison remained a testament to the enduring power of the wild, an ever-present force that shaped the landscape in ways humans could not comprehend. But the warming climate, while giving life to many species, also began to push some beyond their range. As the forests expanded, the tundra that had once been home to the mammoth and woolly rhinoceros shrank into the northernmost corners of the earth. Some species found themselves migrating further north, following the retreating ice and the changing plant life. Others, like the musk oxen and the reindeer, adapted, moving to higher altitudes where the cold still lingered in the shadow of the mountains. This constant shift, this dance of life and death, warmth and cold, was the rhythm of change, the heartbeat of a living, breathing planet. The earth was not static. It was constantly in flux, evolving to meet the challenges and opportunities the world presented. The creatures that thrived in this world, from the smallest insect to the grandest mammoth, were all part of the same cycle, each playing its role in a world that was, even in its moments of stillness, always alive. As the Earth moved further away from the Ice Age, the shifting winds of time began to alter not only the land, but also the way in which life adapted to its environment. Nature's resilience was tested at every turn, as the world continued to change with unpredictable rhythm. Each new season brought with it a subtle but ever-present evolution, a transformation that was both beautiful and brutal in its simplicity. The once endless stretches of cold tundra now existed only in the most remote parts of the planet. The rich biodiversity that bloomed in the wake of the retreating glaciers now filled the spaces where the mammoths and saber-tooths had roamed. The vast plains, though still a dominant feature, began to see the arrival of new species that would adapt to the slowly warming world. These changes were not merely physical, but also ecological, as old habits and survival strategies gave way to new ones. In the forests, the cool winds that had once swept across the frozen land were now filled with the scent of pine and earth. The seasonal shifts, once marked only by the relentless advance of glaciers, now gave way to the vibrant explosion of growth and decay that defined the passage of time. The once still air was filled with the rustling of leaves and the chirping of birds, each song a reminder that life, though fragile, had an incredible way of persisting. The trees grew thicker, their trunks expanding into towering giants that shaded the ground beneath them. The roots of these trees were deeply intertwined with the world below, creating a network of life that would support future generations of creatures and plants. In the plains, the winds carried with them the sound of hooves. The bison, reindeer, and smaller grazing animals moving together in massive herds, following the call of the land. These great migrations were not only a spectacle, but a living example of how ecosystems evolved to accommodate the constant ebb and flow of life. These movements were often dictated by the seasons, but also by the very conditions that had shaped the landscape. A subtle reminder that the earth had been in a perpetual state of change long before humans appeared on the scene. The carnivores that hunted these herds, wolves, bears, and cats, had also adapted to the new world. Their movements were no longer bound to the open steppe, but were shaped by the forests, the rivers, and the shifting grasslands. The apex predators, who once ruled without question, had to adjust to smaller territories and more complex hunting strategies. They had evolved, learned to blend in with their environments, and worked together as never before. These were the same instincts that had shaped life on Earth for millions of years, allowing predators to hone their skills and sharpen their wits to survive in an ever-changing world. Yet, even as the great migrations continued, the Earth began to show signs of stress. The warming temperatures, while nourishing life, also posed challenges for the delicate ecosystems that had formed. The warming of the oceans, the rising sea levels, and the increasing frequency of storms began to shift the climate in ways that were harder to predict. The new, abundant life on Earth was beginning to show cracks in its foundation. The warming world had brought with it both the promise of renewal and the fear of instability. Yet in this fragile balance, the wildness of nature remained. The Earth's capacity to regenerate, adapt, and evolve stood as a testament to the strength of life itself. Even as the winds changed and the seasons grew unpredictable, there was an undeniable truth. Life in all its forms would continue to rise, fall, and rise again. As the Earth continued to awaken and evolve, the quiet reign of the seasons became the ultimate ruler of all life. The cycles of birth, growth, death, and renewal stretched across the planet, governed by the steady march of time. Yet, within this pattern, nature had its own rhythm, an unspoken understanding that life could never be separated from death, and death would always give way to new life. The change of seasons, once marked only by the quiet advance of glaciers, now echoed with the thunder of thunderstorms and the steady rhythm of rain. The earth, no longer shackled by the brutal cold, now had the chance to breathe, to stretch, and to grow. The winters were milder, though not without their bite, and the summers stretched longer, offering a brief but abundant time for life to flourish. In the forests, this change of seasons was evident in every leaf, every flower, every branch. In the spring, new shoots of grass pushed through the earth, their delicate stems reaching for the sun. The trees, once barren, now burst into green, their canopies thick with the promise of new life. Birds returned from their southern migrations, filling the skies with their songs. The air was thick with the hum of life, a buzzing reminder of nature's quiet power. With each season, the cycle began again. In the fall, the trees shed their leaves, not in defeat, but in preparation for the cold that would return. The ground below was covered in the rich tapestry of fallen leaves, which would break down and return their nutrients to the soil. The cycle of decay became the foundation for future growth, as the very earth itself was nourished by its own death. Even in the final throes of autumn, when the land seemed to be preparing for the quiet slumber of winter, life was still at work, regenerating in the most silent and unseen ways. In the plains, the herds of bison and deer continued their endless migrations, tracing paths across the land as they had for generations. The winds whispered through the tall grasses, pushing the animals forward, urging them to continue. These herds, once so large they could stretch for miles, had now adapted to the changing climate, adjusting their migration patterns to follow the growth of vegetation and the shifting weather patterns. The predators, too, had adjusted. Wolves, once solitary hunters, now moved in packs, their howls filling the cold, crisp air of the forests and plains. Their prey had grown smarter, more evasive, and the wolves had learned to adapt. Their once silent movements now carried purpose. Every step, every decision was calculated, part of the natural order that had survived since the dawn of life itself. And yet, despite the beauty and power of the seasons, there was always a quiet awareness in the air, the awareness that the earth was still changing, still shifting beneath the weight of time. The warming world, with its abundant life and flourishing ecosystems, also carried the seeds of uncertainty. The climate continued to change, and with it, the very foundations of the world were being tested. The earth was still a place of great resilience, but it was also a place of fragility. The reign of the seasons was never certain. It was always in flux, just as life itself was. But as the earth moved through its cycles, one season after another, it was clear that life would find its way. No matter how many changes came, the earth would adapt, evolve, and continue its journey through time. As the seasons continued to shape the land, a quiet truth began to emerge, a truth woven into every inch of the Earth's recovery. While life was thriving, there was an undeniable fragility to the balance that had been so carefully restored. Beneath the lush canopies of the forests, across the sprawling plains, and beneath the surface of the rivers, the ecosystems that had once been shattered by the Ice Age were still in the process of finding stability. Every new cycle of growth brought with it new challenges, and with those challenges came a reminder of how delicate the Earth's balance truly was. The warming climate, though a source of life for many species, also brought with it changes that were harder to predict. In some regions, rainfall patterns shifted, leaving some parts of the land dry and cracked, while others experienced floods that washed away the fragile ecosystems struggling to establish themselves. The wild, once a place of untamed beauty, now had to adapt to the changing rhythms of nature, and some creatures struggled to keep pace with the world's shifting dynamics. The great bison herds, though still roaming in vast numbers, faced challenges they had never encountered before. The lush grasses that had once been their primary food source were becoming sparse in some areas. In their place, invasive plants, better suited to the changing climate, began to take root, altering the landscape that the bison had known for millennia. The animals, once the rulers of the plains, were now finding their world altered in ways they had never anticipated. Their migratory patterns, once predictable and steady, began to shift as they moved to find new grazing grounds. And with the bison's migration came a new reality. Predators had to adapt as well. Wolves, which had once hunted in large packs across the open plains, now found themselves forced to follow the herds more closely, adapting their hunting techniques to the changing terrain. Their once quiet methods of ambush were now supplemented with new strategies: tracking, patience, and clever cooperation. But as the bison's movements became more unpredictable, even the wolves faced challenges they had not expected. Their survival, once a matter of instinct, now relied on the ability to adapt to the ever-changing landscape. In the forests, the predators that had once stalked the underbrush were also finding their world changing. Lynxes, foxes, and smaller cats that had thrived on the abundance of prey were now struggling to find food in the denser, more competitive environment. With the rise of new species, competition for resources was fiercer than ever. These predators, once masters of their domains, now had to become more resourceful, learning new tactics and hunting methods to survive. The quiet, unseen struggles for dominance played out in the shadows of the forest, where each paw print and rustling leaf spoke to the changing world. Even the smallest creatures, those that lived beneath the soil or in the hidden corners of the forests, were beginning to feel the weight of the changes. The insects, once the lifeblood of the forest ecosystem, now found themselves facing new challenges. The rising temperatures and changing plant life altered the seasonal patterns of insects, affecting their ability to pollinate and feed on certain plants. Without the insects to support the growth of plants, The very foundation of the ecosystem began to show signs of strain. The Earth, though resilient, was showing that no recovery was ever truly permanent. The wild, for all its beauty and strength, was a place of constant change. Life in all its forms was in a constant state of adaptation. The delicate balance that had been struck after the Ice Age was not a static achievement. It was an ongoing process, a delicate dance between growth and decay, life and death. Even as the earth grew richer with life, it was clear that the fragility of that balance would always be at the heart of the natural world. As the earth continued its transformation, something remarkable began to emerge from the fragility of the balance. A quiet, almost invisible force that threaded through every organism, from the tiniest ant to the grandest tree. It was the force of resilience, the ability to bend with the winds of change and yet, in the end, survive. This resilience was not the strength of any one creature, but the sum of all the interactions in the ecosystem, a constant adaptation to the unpredictable forces that shaped the world. In the forests, this resilience could be seen in the slow but steady recovery of the trees. The mighty oaks and pines which had once struggled to take root were now thriving. Their branches stretched toward the sky, weaving together a canopy that sheltered not only other plants, but the creatures that had returned to the land. Beneath the trees, ferns and wildflowers pushed their way through the soft earth, taking root in the rich soil that had been nourished by generations of fallen leaves. The forest floor, once barren and cold, was now alive with movement, with the pulse of the creatures that inhabited it. But even as the trees grew tall and strong, they too faced their challenges. The warmer climate brought with it new pests, beetles that tunneled through the bark, fungi that threatened to rot the trunks from the inside. Yet the trees adapted. Their bark thickened, their roots dug deeper into the soil. The forest as a whole shifted, with new species of plants and animals coming to fill the spaces left behind by those that could not survive the changing world. In the plains, the resilience of the bison was becoming evident. Though their numbers had once been threatened by overhunting and a changing landscape, they were now adapting to the world around them. Their herds, though smaller in some regions, had become more mobile, shifting their grazing patterns to find the grasses that would nourish them. They were learning to coexist with the changing environment, their survival now reliant on their ability to adjust rather than resist the changes happening around them. In this way, the bison were a symbol of nature's resilience, a reminder that even in the face of adversity, life could find a way forward. The predators, too, had adapted. The wolves, which had once hunted in the open plains, were now more adept at navigating the forests, learning to move with the shadows of the trees. Their packs were tighter, their strategies more refined. They no longer relied on brute force alone, but on cooperation, patience, and cunning. The wolves were no longer just hunters. They were survivors, evolving with the changing world around them. But it was not only the large creatures that exhibited resilience. In the wetlands, the insects had become a symbol of nature's adaptability. Dragonflies, mosquitoes, and beetles, once at the mercy of fluctuating temperatures and changing plants, had evolved to cope with the new environment. Their life cycles had shifted to match the seasonal rhythms of the earth, ensuring that they could continue to thrive in the ever-changing world. They were part of the unseen network of life that held the ecosystem together, their tiny wings buzzing through the air as they moved between plants and water, ensuring that the cycle of life would continue. In the oceans, the krill and plankton that once thrived in colder waters had shifted their ranges, adapting to the warming seas. As the temperature of the oceans rose, these tiny creatures followed the currents, their populations thriving in new regions. The whales, too, had adapted, adjusting their migration patterns to follow the shifting food sources. Their massive bodies, once confined to cold waters, now roamed the warming seas, their songs echoing through the depths. The resilience of life was not about individual strength. It was about the collective adaptability of all the creatures that called the earth home. Each organism, no matter how small or large, played its part in the survival of the whole. And as the seasons changed, as the climate shifted, it was this resilience, this quiet ability to adapt, that ensured the survival of life on Earth. As the Earth continued to evolve in the wake of the Ice Age, there was an undeniable sense of hope that spread through the land. The scars of the past, though still visible, were no longer the defining features of the planet. Life had not only endured the cold, it had embraced the warmth, the shifting winds, and the changing seasons. The earth was no longer a place of frozen stillness, but a world of vibrant growth, of constant change and adaptation. The promise of tomorrow lay in the resilience of the ecosystems that had begun to take root. In the forests, the trees that had once been sparse and stunted were now thick and full, their canopies reaching high into the sky, filtering sunlight and creating shelter for a variety of species. The underbrush, once bare and cold, was alive with the rustling of small mammals, insects, and the occasional large predator. The cycle of life that had been interrupted by the Ice Age had now resumed, with each season bringing a new chapter of growth, decay, and renewal. Across the plains, the bison herds that had once seemed on the brink of extinction were now thriving once more. Their migrations, though altered by the warming climate, continued as they had for millennia. The land they grazed on was lush and abundant, nourished by the rain that fell more regularly with each passing year. The bison were a symbol of the earth's power to recover, to heal, and to continue on its journey of life. The predators, ever the guardians of the balance, had found their place in this new world. Wolves, foxes, and lynxes moved with purpose through the forests and across the plains. Their once solitary existence had evolved into tight-knit family units that relied on cooperation and strategy. They no longer hunted alone but worked together in packs, ensuring that the cycle of life remained in balance. These predators, like the trees and the bison, were not just survivors. They were a vital part of the web of life that had been slowly re-established. And in the oceans, the rhythm of the tides and the pulse of the currents continued to drive life forward. The great whales, once confined to colder waters, now roamed the warming seas, their bodies massive and graceful as they followed the currents to feed on the abundant krill. These creatures, the giants of the sea, were a reminder of the Earth's ability to adapt to the changing climate and to continue its journey toward renewal. Even in the smallest corners of the Earth, life was taking root. The insects that buzzed through the air, the frogs that croaked in the wetlands, and the birds that soared across the skies were all part of a greater promise. The promise that life, in all its forms, would continue to adapt, evolve, and thrive. The Earth had proven itself resilient, and the future it promised was one of continued growth and change. The warmth of the Earth, once a terrifying force that threatened to alter the very fabric of life, had become a force for renewal. It was the promise of tomorrow, the idea that life could not only endure but flourish in the face of change. The cycles of the past had laid the foundation, but the future was an open canvas, ready to be painted with the colors of life. With each passing year, the changes in the world, both grand and subtle, began to form ripples. Small, seemingly insignificant shifts that, over time, altered the very fabric of life. These ripples were felt not only across the land, but also in the skies, the oceans, and the very ecosystems that made up the world. The Earth was a vast network of interconnected forces, each one shaping the others in a dance of cause and effect. Even the smallest of changes had consequences, and these ripples would be felt for generations to come. The warming climate that had allowed life to flourish in places once unimaginable now presented new challenges. The once predictable seasonal rhythms began to shift, creating a world that was no longer entirely in sync with the familiar patterns of the past. The warm summers that had brought new growth now brought heat waves that threatened to dry up the lands. The rains, though more frequent, were becoming more erratic, with sudden floods and droughts that tested the resilience of the planet's ecosystems. In the forests, the trees that had once grown strong and tall now found themselves struggling against these changing conditions. Some species, better adapted to the cooler, more stable climate of the past, began to wither, their leaves turning yellow and brittle as the heat took its toll. Others, more tolerant of the warming temperatures, took their place, but the balance was fragile. The changing rainfall patterns affected the roots of the trees, with some areas receiving too much water and others too little. In the heart of the forests, these changes were subtle, but the ripple effect was undeniable. The plains, too, were feeling the shift. The once abundant grasses that had nourished the bison herds were beginning to suffer. The drying soil and more frequent droughts left the grasses struggling to survive, and with them, the bison. The herds, once so strong and numerous, found themselves facing a world of uncertainty. Their migration patterns, so deeply ingrained in their instincts, had to be adjusted to match the changing landscape. The cycle of life, once so predictable, was now influenced by forces outside of anyone's control. Yet, even as these ripples spread through the land, there was a quiet resilience in the world. The predators, once struggling to adapt to a shrinking food supply, had learned to find new prey. The wolves, now tracking smaller herds of bison and other animals, had become more efficient hunters, their instincts sharpening as the land around them shifted. Their role in the ecosystem was as vital as ever, ensuring that the populations of herbivores remained in check and the balance of life continued. The small creatures, too, had learned to adjust. Insects, whose populations had once been dependent on specific plants and flowers, now found new sources of food in the ever-changing landscape. The birds that had once migrated to escape the cold now faced new challenges, as the seasons no longer followed their predictable path. Yet, like the wolves and the bison, the birds adapted. They adjusted their flight paths, their timing, and their feeding habits, learning to survive in a world that was no longer bound by the rhythms of the past. In the oceans, the changes were felt in similar ways. The once cold waters that had supported certain species of fish and marine life had warmed, forcing creatures to either migrate to new, cooler waters or adapt to the changing conditions. The krill, once abundant in the cold waters, were now struggling to survive in the warmer seas. The whales, whose migrations had once been determined by the availability of food, now faced new challenges in finding the sustenance they needed to survive. And yet, in the face of all these changes, there was a profound sense of continuity. The ripples that were being felt across the land, the sea, and the sky were not the end of life. They were a part of its evolution. The earth had always changed, and it would continue to change. The resilience of life in all its forms was the key to the future. No matter how unpredictable the climate, no matter how challenging the landscape, life would always find a way. It was in the quiet ripple of change that the true power of the earth was revealed, the power of adaptation, of evolution, and of renewal. As the seasons continued to shift and the earth responded, the planet found itself standing at a precipice, a threshold between what had been and what was yet to come. The familiar patterns of the past, shaped by the steady rhythm of ice age cycles, had been replaced with something new, something uncertain. The earth had recovered from the cold, but now it faced new challenges. The balance of life was being tested in ways it never had before, and the future of the ecosystems that had only recently blossomed hung in the balance. The forests, once dense with the shade of towering trees, were feeling the weight of change. The warming climate, while allowing new species to flourish, also brought with it unpredictable extremes. In some places, the trees that had once thrived in cooler temperatures were now retreating northward, seeking the refuge of higher altitudes and cooler air. The balance of the forest floor was shifting as new species of plants took root. trees like birches and maples, better suited to warmer conditions, began to replace the once dominant pines and oaks. While some species adapted, others struggled to survive. The rapid changes were creating a fragmented landscape, where once stable ecosystems were now slowly morphing into something entirely different. On the plains, the bison, symbols of the vast, open grasslands, were facing their own challenges. The grasses that had once provided an abundance of food were now being replaced by more drought-resistant plants, and the animals that grazed on them had to adapt. The bison, with their once predictable migrations, were now forced to move farther in search of new grazing grounds. Their herds, once large and sweeping across the land, were becoming smaller and more scattered, struggling to find the resources they had once relied upon. The predators that had followed these herds, wolves, coyotes, and bears, were also adapting to the changing environment. The wolves, which had once hunted in large packs across vast plains, now had to become more strategic. The smaller, fragmented bison herds were harder to track, and the wolves had to rely on patience and precision. Their hunts, once driven by the sheer power of a pack, had become more dependent on their ability to blend into the changing landscape, making use of the forest's cover and the smaller prey that began to take over the plains. In the wetlands, the environment was shifting too. Rising temperatures meant that the wetlands, once stable and predictable, were now subject to more frequent floods and droughts. The wildlife that depended on these ecosystems, frogs, insects, birds, had to adjust. Some species thrived in the changing conditions, while others struggled to keep up with the rapidly shifting climate. The wetlands, which had once been constant, were becoming a place of uncertainty, a reflection of the larger changes occurring across the planet. Even in the oceans, life was changing. The warming seas were disrupting the balance of marine ecosystems. Fish species that had once thrived in cooler waters were now migrating north, and those that had adapted to warmer waters were moving in. The krill, the tiny organisms that were the foundation of marine life, were struggling to survive in the changing waters. The whales, whose migrations had once been dictated by the availability of krill, now faced a world where their feeding grounds were becoming harder to find. The Earth, at the threshold of change, stood at a critical juncture. The balance that had been carefully restored after the Ice Age was now being tested by forces outside of anyone's control. The resilience of life, however, remained a guiding force. Nature would adapt, evolve, and survive, just as it always had. But the future of the planet was uncertain, and only time would tell what form this new world would take. As the Earth stood at the threshold of change, there was something deeply humbling about the realization that the forces shaping the planet were ancient, far older than humanity itself. The land, the skies, and the oceans had undergone vast transformations over millions of years, and the new world emerging from the thawing of the Ice Age was no exception. But even as life adapted to the warming climate, it was clear that nature's rhythms were far from predictable. The ancient forces of the Earth, forces that had shaped the planet for eons, still held sway over the land. Volcanic eruptions, once a rare and dramatic event, now seemed more frequent. These volcanic forces were reshaping the landscape in ways that many species had never encountered. The ash clouds that poured from these eruptions blanketed the sky, blocking the sun's warmth and cooling the atmosphere for brief periods. These disruptions, though temporary, reminded the Earth's creatures that change was not always gradual or predictable. The planet's heartbeat had always been shaped by violent and unpredictable events, from massive volcanic eruptions to asteroid impacts that had once wiped out entire species. In the forests, the trees that had grown tall and strong in the warmer climate now faced new challenges. As volcanic ash settled on the land, it changed the composition of the soil, forcing the plants to adapt or die. The younger generations of trees were harder to grow, as the ash prevented some plants from sprouting. The forest floor was thick with the debris, a reminder that the Earth's recovery was never linear. The dense canopies that had once offered shelter to small creatures now created barriers to sunlight, preventing the smaller plants from flourishing. But nature had a way of recalibrating itself. In time, new species of plants began to take root, their seeds carried by the wind or the animals that moved across the land. The wetlands, once a haven of stillness and abundance, were also vulnerable to these ancient forces. The rise in water levels, driven by the melting ice and the constant shifting of tectonic plates, created new flood zones. The wetlands began to change in shape and size, becoming more scattered and fragmented. Some species, like the frogs and waterfowl, thrived in these new conditions, while others, like the insects that had once dominated the water's surface, struggled to adapt. The flow of the rivers changed as well, their currents altered by the land's upheaval, creating new wetlands and dry plains in places where they had never existed before. The oceans, too, felt the tremors of the planet's deep forces. As the Earth's temperature rose, sea levels continued to rise, flooding once productive coastal areas. Entire ecosystems that had relied on the shallow waters of the oceans now found themselves displaced. Coral reefs, once teeming with life, were dying due to the warming waters and the shifting patterns of ocean currents. Yet, there was hope. New species of fish and marine life were emerging in the deeper, cooler parts of the oceans, where life still found a way to survive. Even the creatures that roamed the land, whether small mammals or apex predators, felt the distant pull of these ancient forces. The prey that the wolves and lynxes hunted had begun to shift in response to the warming climate. Their migration patterns, once predictable, were now in flux. These creatures, like the land itself, were caught between the stability of the past and the uncertainty of the future. And yet, despite all these challenges, there was something undeniably beautiful about the Earth's resilience. The land was never the same from one season to the next. It had survived ice ages, volcanic eruptions, and cataclysmic events far beyond the scope of human imagination. Now it was once again showing its ability to heal, to adapt, and to find a new path forward. The earth, in all its quiet glory, had endured and would continue to endure, no matter the forces that sought to shape it. Beneath the grand struggles and visible changes that defined the surface of the earth, there were smaller, less noticed forces working tirelessly to shape the world. These unseen shapers, the microorganisms, fungi, and bacteria, played an integral role in the Earth's recovery, quietly influencing life in ways too subtle for the eye to see, yet too powerful for survival to exist without. The soil, the foundation upon which so much life depended, was home to countless microorganisms that worked in symbiosis with the plants and trees. These tiny organisms, though invisible to the naked eye, were responsible for breaking down organic material, turning dead plants and animals into nutrients that would nourish the living. Without them, the cycle of life would not have continued. The nutrients that flowed through the soil were not just a gift of nature, but a collaboration of life, from the largest predator to the smallest microbe. Fungi, too, were a vital part of the unseen network that bound the ecosystems together. These networks of mycelium, stretching out beneath the forest floor, connected trees and plants in a shared network of communication. Through these fungal networks, trees could exchange nutrients, warn each other of disease, and even send messages about environmental changes. This underground web, which had been formed over millions of years, was the Earth's lifeblood, quietly maintaining the balance that allowed forests to grow, rivers to flow, and the air to stay fresh. In the waters, the unseen shapers continued their work. Algae, tiny in size yet immense in impact, formed the base of the marine food chain. These microscopic organisms absorbed sunlight, converting it into energy that would nourish the fish, whales, and other creatures that swam through the seas. Without algae, the oceans would not have supported the vast life they did. Their role in producing oxygen and feeding the marine food web was immeasurable. Similarly, in the wetlands, microbes worked their magic, breaking down decaying matter and filtering the water, ensuring that the ecosystem remained healthy and balanced. These tiny organisms were the unseen caretakers of the land, performing tasks too small to notice, yet essential to life. When the water levels fluctuated and new flood zones appeared, these microorganisms adapted quickly, ensuring that the ecosystem didn't collapse under the pressure of constant change. Even in the atmosphere, unseen forces were at work. The microbes that lived in the soil and oceans helped regulate the Earth's climate by absorbing carbon dioxide, a key player in the planet's temperature regulation. These minute beings acted as a natural buffer against the warming world, slowly stabilizing the balance between the carbon released into the atmosphere and the carbon locked away in the soil and oceans. While the mighty forests grew tall, the great herds of bison continued their migrations, and the predators prowled the land. It was the unseen forces, the tiniest organisms, that were ensuring the survival of the whole. Life, in all its forms, was dependent on this invisible web of connection. The health of the planet, from the tallest tree to the smallest bacterium, was bound together by forces that could not be seen but could be felt in every breath of air, in every sip of water, and in every pulse of the earth itself. The resilience of the earth and the quiet strength of the unseen shapers was a reminder that life, in all its complexity, was never just about the visible. The smallest actions, the tiniest creatures, had the power to sustain the greatest systems of life. In this quiet, invisible dance, the Earth's ecosystems continued to recover, evolve, and thrive. As life continued to unfold across the land, the Earth found itself at a critical tipping point, an inflection where the forces of nature, once in delicate balance, now teetered between harmony and chaos. The delicate web of ecosystems that had risen from the thaw of the Ice Age was now facing an accelerated challenge, one that had not been seen for millennia. While the planet had been recovering, the impact of the warming climate was becoming undeniable. Species that had adapted to the changing world found themselves struggling with the speed of those changes. The once predictable patterns of seasons, rainfall, and migration had become increasingly erratic, leaving life to adjust at a pace that was much faster than it had ever known. In the forests, the trees that had so recently flourished in the new warmth began to show signs of stress. While some species, like the faster-growing birches and maples, adapted more easily to the changing conditions, others, older species like the mighty oak, began to suffer. Their growth slowed as they struggled to keep up with rising temperatures and increasingly dry conditions. The trees, the silent sentinels of the forests, seemed to stand as witnesses to a world changing faster than they could adapt. The once dominant oaks began to be replaced by hardier species better suited to the warmer climates. But it wasn't just the trees that were feeling the pressure. The animals that depended on the forests were also struggling. Deer and smaller herbivores found the changing vegetation harder to navigate, as the once abundant plant life they had grazed on was replaced by tougher, less palatable species. This change in available food sources sent ripples through the food web, forcing predators to adapt their hunting methods. Wolves, once used to chasing the swift bison and reindeer across the plains, now had to track smaller, more elusive prey through increasingly dense underbrush. Their hunts became longer and more taxing, and they were forced to venture into areas that had once been outside their territory. The wetlands, too, were showing signs of strain. Once an area rich with life, they were now dealing with fluctuations in water levels that made their delicate ecosystems unstable. Rising temperatures and erratic rainfall were altering the flow of water, causing some wetlands to dry up while others became flooded. These changes disrupted the habitats of countless species, from amphibians and insects to birds and larger mammals. The once thriving wetlands, which had acted as both a buffer and a sanctuary for many species, now stood in jeopardy. In the oceans, the warming waters were causing upheaval in the delicate marine ecosystems. Coral reefs, which had once provided shelter and sustenance for countless species, were dying due to the rising temperatures and acidification of the oceans. The krill that whales depended on were moving farther from their traditional feeding grounds, and the larger marine mammals, once so graceful in their migrations, were now finding it more difficult to follow their food. As the planet warmed, the changes that had once been gradual began to accelerate. The tipping point seemed to be upon them, the point where the Earth's ecosystems could no longer recover at the pace they had before. Life was still fighting to adapt, still finding ways to evolve, but it was clear that the struggle had become more intense. The once harmonious rhythms of the planet were being pushed to their limits. The planet, though still resilient, was no longer certain of its ability to heal without further disturbance. Yet, even in the face of these challenges, there was hope. Nature had always adapted to change, and the strength of life in all its forms was still apparent. The question remained, could the Earth, in all its fragility and resilience, find a way to tip the scales back toward balance? As the planet reached its tipping point, a sense of urgency began to permeate the air, the waters, and the very soil beneath the feet of every living creature. The Earth, with all its beauty and complexity, was at a crossroads. The ecosystems that had been so carefully rebuilt in the wake of the Ice Age now found themselves under threat, not from the cold, but from the force of change that had brought warmth and abundance to the world. It was a time when the resilience of life would be tested like never before. In the forests, the trees stood as silent witnesses to the delicate balance between life and death. They had flourished in the new warmth, their branches reaching toward the sky as they stretched to embrace the sun. But now, as the climate continued to shift, the trees found themselves struggling to survive. The soil, once rich and fertile, had begun to lose its nutrients, and the rains that had once nurtured the land were now too erratic. The trees, no longer able to rely on the predictable rhythms of nature, had to adapt. Some species began to retreat to higher altitudes, seeking the cool air of the mountain slopes. Others, more resilient to the warming climate, began to dominate the forest floor, spreading their roots deeper and reaching for the sun with renewed vigor. In the plains, the herds of bison and deer moved with greater uncertainty, no longer following the predictable paths they had taken for generations. The changing plant life meant that their grazing patterns had to shift as well. The grasses they once relied on were becoming scarcer, replaced by hardier plants that were less nutritious. The bison, though still massive and powerful, had to become more resourceful, seeking out new grazing grounds as the old ones grew barren. Their movements, once a steady rhythm across the land, had become erratic, shaped by the changing climate and the need to find food and water. The predators that had once stalked these herds, wolves, coyotes, and bears, too felt the pull of adaptation. Their hunting strategies had to evolve. The wolves, once able to rely on large, predictable prey, now had to become more agile, learning to track smaller and faster animals. Their once vast territory, where they roamed freely, was now fragmented, and they were forced to adapt to new territories and new challenges. The lynxes, with their silent grace, had learned to hunt in the denser forests, using the cover of trees to ambush their prey. They had become masters of stealth, relying on patience and precision to catch their food. But it wasn't just the large predators that had to adapt. The smallest creatures, like the insects, amphibians, and rodents, had also begun to change. The warmer climate meant that some species could no longer survive in the environments they once called home. Many had to move to cooler areas, while others evolved to withstand the higher temperatures. The bees, once the silent pollinators of the world, now had to adapt to longer seasons and more erratic blooming periods. Their behavior had changed as they moved farther to find food sources that had become more spread out and unpredictable. In the oceans, the same battle to adapt was unfolding. Coral reefs, once vibrant with life, now faced the threat of bleaching as the water temperatures rose. Fish species that had once thrived in colder waters were migrating to new, cooler areas, while those suited for the warmer waters of the Earth's changing oceans were moving in. The krill that had once sustained the great whales were now more scattered, and the marine mammals were forced to follow the currents in search of new feeding grounds. Life, it seemed, had no choice but to adapt. The call to change was clear, and every species, from the tallest trees to the smallest insects, was answering. In this world of uncertainty, the Earth was once again proving its resilience. Though the future remained uncertain, the ability to adapt, to evolve, and to survive was as much a part of the Earth's story as the Ice Age itself. As the Earth entered this new phase, the horizon began to shift, not just in the physical landscape, but in the way life responded to the changes around it. What had once been a predictable, rhythmic world, defined by seasons, migrations, and the steady pulse of nature, was now a place of constant flux. The warming climate, with its unpredictable swings, had already started to reshape ecosystems, and those that adapted found their world becoming vastly different from the one their ancestors had known. The forests were the first to show the signs of these new realities. The towering pines and oaks, which had once ruled the landscape, were gradually being replaced by species that thrived in the new, warmer conditions. Fast-growing species like birches and maples began to dominate, their leaves filling the canopy and blocking out the light for those that had previously ruled the forest. The forest floor, which had once been a thick carpet of moss and rich soil, now struggled to support the new growth. The once stable ecosystem was shifting, the quiet rhythm of the trees replaced by a sense of competition as species vied for sunlight, space, and nutrients. At the same time, the plains, once home to massive herds of bison and deer, were changing as well. The large, predictable migrations that had once defined these ecosystems were becoming more scattered. The bison, still powerful and resilient, now found themselves in smaller herds, their grazing patterns altered by the changing climate and the shrinking grasslands. The land that had once been their vast kingdom was now shared with smaller creatures, rabbits, prairie dogs, and other rodents that had found niches in the shifting environment. These small mammals, once relegated to the edges of the plains, now played vital roles in maintaining the health of the land, aerating the soil and feeding a new generation of predators. For the predators, these changes presented new challenges. Wolves, who had once chased the bison across the plains, now had to become more adaptable. Smaller prey was now more abundant, but it required different strategies. Their packs, once used to chasing large herds across the open space, now had to rely on stealth and coordination, becoming more efficient hunters of the smaller, faster creatures that had come to dominate the land. Even the mighty bears, once spread across vast expanses of land, now found themselves living in smaller, more fragmented territories, adapting to the new rhythm of the land. In the oceans, the warming waters were causing their own set of changes. Species that had once thrived in cooler waters were shifting their ranges, migrating to more temperate areas. The krill, the base of the ocean's food chain, were moving in search of new feeding grounds, which in turn forced whales and dolphins to follow. The balance of the seas, once stable, was now in a state of flux, with marine life adapting to the changing conditions. The Earth, at this moment, was not the same planet it had been a century ago, and it was clear that it would never return to its former state. Life had adapted, evolved, and continued, but the patterns of the past had been irrevocably altered. As ecosystems evolved, so too did the creatures within them. The horizon, once a fixed point in the distance, had become something more fluid, a symbol of a world in constant change, adapting to new challenges, but continuing its dance of life, death, and renewal. Amid the rapid changes sweeping across the planet, there was an enduring force that continued to shape life on Earth. Resilience. Deeply rooted in every living organism, from the tallest tree to the smallest insect, resilience had allowed life to persist through ages of transformation. Even as ecosystems faced unprecedented challenges, this quiet strength ensured that life continued to evolve and adapt. In the forests, the power of resilience was on full display. As the warming climate altered the landscape, the forests, too, had to adapt. Where once pines and oaks dominated, new species like birches and maples began to thrive in the shifting temperatures. These trees, faster growing and better suited to the changing environment, were now the leaders of the forest, replacing older species that could no longer keep up. Despite the challenges of the changing climate, the forest floor had become rich with new life. Ferns, wildflowers, and shrubs that had once struggled to grow beneath the shade of older trees. Even in competition, new life was finding a way to survive and grow. The forest, once a place of stability, was now a vibrant tapestry of life in transition. This transformation, however, did not come without difficulty. The newer trees, though fast-growing, had to compete fiercely for space and nutrients. Some species thrived, while others faded, unable to adapt to the competition. Yet, in this ongoing cycle of change, the forest remained resilient. The slower-growing trees still found their place in the ecosystem, providing shelter for smaller creatures and enriching the soil with their decaying leaves. The forest was not static. It was dynamic, constantly adapting to the evolving environment. On the plains, the bison, once the undisputed rulers of the grasslands, now faced a changing world. The vast, open plains that had provided them with endless grazing had begun to shrink, replaced by denser vegetation that was harder to consume. The bison, however, were not defeated. They adapted, moving in smaller herds and searching for new grazing grounds as the land changed. Their survival, once dictated by the abundance of grasses, now depended on their ability to adjust to a more fragmented world. Even as their environment shifted, the bison's resilience allowed them to push forward, finding new paths and new sources of food. The predators that relied on the bison, wolves, coyotes, and bears, too had to adapt. With the bison herds now more scattered, wolves had to refine their hunting strategies. Their packs became more coordinated, relying on stealth and patience to hunt smaller, more elusive prey. These predators, once focused on large, predictable herds, now had to become more versatile, using the changing landscape to their advantage. Their survival was a testament to the resilience of nature, adapting, adjusting, and thriving in a shifting world. Even the wetlands, once stable and predictable, began to change. As water levels fluctuated, some species of insects, amphibians, and birds found themselves struggling. But resilience, again, proved strong. New plant species began to take root in the wetlands, and creatures found new ways to thrive in the altered environment. The wetlands, though disrupted, remained a source of life, demonstrating that even in the face of change, the ability to adapt and survive was crucial to the health of the earth. Resilience, in every form, had always been the backbone of life. It was this quiet, persistent strength that allowed the planet to recover from the cold of the Ice Age, and it would continue to guide life as it faced the challenges of the future. Despite the resilience of life, the Earth's journey toward balance was never without its moments of uncertainty. For all the strength shown by plants, animals, and ecosystems, the planet remained fragile, vulnerable to the rapid changes that were sweeping across it. Hope, though abundant, was not without its fragility, and the balance between life and death was constantly tested by the forces of nature. As the climate continued to warm, the delicate balance of ecosystems grew more precarious. The forests, though resilient, now faced the threat of droughts, wildfires, and unpredictable weather patterns. Trees that had once flourished in the warmth now found themselves struggling to survive as the land dried out. Even the hardiest species, like the pines and maples, found themselves battling not just for light and nutrients, but for water. The soil, once rich with life, began to show signs of depletion. As the temperature rose, the water that had nourished the land became more scarce, and many plants, once abundant, began to fade. In the plains, the bison, despite their adaptability, found themselves facing a new threat: the shrinking availability of food. The grasses that had once sustained them were becoming less abundant, replaced by shrubs and invasive plants that were harder to digest. The bison herds, once vast and sweeping across the land, now moved more cautiously, seeking out grazing grounds that were harder to find. Their migration patterns, once predictable, were becoming more erratic, and their survival seemed less certain. The balance of the plains, once so firmly anchored by the massive herds of bison, was now in flux, with new challenges emerging at every turn. The predators, too, were feeling the pressure. Wolves, coyotes, and other hunters had adapted their strategies to keep pace with the changes in prey. But their survival was also tied to the success of the herds. If the bison struggled to find food, the wolves struggled to find prey. The balance between predator and prey was delicate, and each change, no matter how small, rippled through the entire ecosystem. Even the bears, once dominant in the forests and plains, found themselves competing for food sources that were becoming increasingly scarce. In the oceans, the warming waters were altering marine life in profound ways. The coral reefs, which had once been teeming with life, were now dying off due to the rising temperatures and acidification of the seas. Species of fish and marine mammals, once abundant in the cold waters, were migrating to new areas, leaving the ecosystems they had once thrived in. The krill, essential to the food chain, were becoming less abundant, affecting not just the whales, but the entire oceanic system. The seas, once the lifeblood of the planet, were now showing signs of strain. The balance that had existed for millions of years was becoming fragile, and the future of marine life seemed uncertain. Yet, despite the fragility of hope, the Earth's resilience remained. Life continued to adapt, to evolve, and to push forward. The changes, though overwhelming at times, were not the end. They were part of the ever-unfolding story of the planet, a story of survival, of renewal, and of the constant struggle to maintain balance. The fragility of hope was matched only by its strength, and it was this strength that would guide the Earth into whatever future lay ahead. As the Earth continued to evolve, something profound became clear. Everything was connected. From the deepest oceans to the highest mountain peaks, life was intertwined in ways that were far more intricate than anyone could have imagined. The land, the air, the waters, and the creatures, all of them played a part in the dance of life, each affecting the others in ways that could be seen only when viewed as a whole. It was a web of existence, where every action, no matter how small, had a ripple effect on the entire planet. In the forests, this interconnectedness was reflected in the way the trees, plants, and animals coexisted. The trees, with their deep roots reaching into the earth, provided shelter and sustenance to countless creatures. The birds that perched in their branches helped spread seeds, ensuring the survival of future generations of plants. The insects, from bees to beetles, worked tirelessly to pollinate the flowers and fruit, enabling the cycle of growth to continue. Beneath the surface, fungi and microorganisms broke down decaying plant matter, returning nutrients to the soil and enriching the land that nourished the trees. In this way, the forest was not just a collection of individual organisms, but a living, breathing entity, constantly in motion and working together to support life. On the plains, the bison herds, though struggling with the changing climate, still played a crucial role in maintaining the balance of the ecosystem. Their grazing kept the grasslands from becoming overgrown, allowing other plants to thrive and creating space for smaller animals to flourish. The predators, from wolves to coyotes, kept the populations of herbivores in check, ensuring that no one species grew too numerous. In this way, the cycle of life on the plains remained in balance, with each creature playing its part. In the wetlands, the balance was no less delicate. The plants that thrived in the water not only provided food for the creatures that lived there, but helped filter the water, keeping it clean and healthy. The amphibians, insects, and birds that called the wetlands home were integral to this delicate system, relying on the plants for food and shelter, while simultaneously helping to spread seeds and pollinate flowers. The wetlands, though constantly changing with the rise and fall of water levels, remained a vital part of the ecosystem, a place where life could flourish and adapt. The oceans, too, were a testament to the interconnectedness of life. The krill, tiny and fragile, formed the foundation of the marine food chain, feeding fish, whales, and seabirds. The coral reefs, though now under threat, were once bustling with life, providing shelter and sustenance for countless species. The warming waters and acidification of the oceans were disrupting this delicate balance. But even in the face of these challenges, life found a way to adapt. Marine species shifted their ranges, seeking cooler waters and new feeding grounds, while some species, more resilient to the changes, continued to thrive. The interconnectedness of life on Earth was both a source of strength and a reminder of the fragility of the planet. Every ecosystem, every creature, was part of a larger system, a system that was constantly in flux. The world had always been a place of change, but now, more than ever, the Earth needed to rely on its interwoven paths to maintain balance. The future, though uncertain, would depend on how life adapted, how it worked together, and how it learned to navigate the shifting currents of change. As the Earth continued its slow but determined march forward, it became evident that the planet was not just recovering from the Ice Age. It was entering a new era, one shaped not only by the forces of nature, but also by the resilience and adaptability of life itself. The old rhythms of the world, the steady patterns of growth and decay, had been disrupted, and now, in the wake of this transformation, the Earth stood on the cusp of something entirely new. The dawn of this new era was not marked by a single event or moment, but by the subtle yet undeniable shift in how life interacted with the world around it. The forests, still changing, had become a testament to life's capacity for adaptation. The trees that had once been the giants of the land had made way for new species better suited to the evolving climate. Their roots, deep in the earth, connected them to the land in ways that allowed them to survive in a world that was no longer predictable. The forest floor, once barren in some areas, had become a thriving hub of activity. New plant species grew in abundance, their flowers attracting pollinators and their roots enriching the soil. The creatures of the forest, from the smallest insect to the largest predator, had learned to coexist in a constantly shifting environment. Life in the forest had not only survived, it had thrived. In the plains, the bison herds, though smaller and more scattered, had continued their journey across the land, now moving in patterns dictated by the changing world. The predators, once relying on the large, predictable herds, had become more agile and resourceful, learning new hunting techniques to survive. The land itself, once dominated by vast open spaces, was now home to a more diverse range of species. Small mammals, birds, and insects had found niches in the changing ecosystem, filling roles once reserved for larger creatures. The plains had become a landscape of constant change, where life had to adapt or be left behind. The wetlands, too, had evolved, their once predictable rhythms now shaped by fluctuating water levels and shifting plant life. The creatures that called the wetlands home had learned to adapt to these changes, with new species emerging to fill the gaps left by those that could not survive. The waters, though uncertain, had become a source of life, providing sustenance and shelter for countless animals. The wetlands, like the forests and plains, had become a symbol of life's ability to adapt to the changing environment. In the oceans, the warming waters had brought new challenges, but life continued to find its way. Marine species that had once been confined to colder waters now adapted to the rising temperatures, moving to new areas and developing new behaviors. The coral reefs, though in danger, still teemed with life, their ecosystems shifting in response to the changing waters. The krill, still the foundation of the marine food chain, adapted to the changing currents and temperatures, ensuring that the larger creatures that relied on them would survive. The oceans, once so predictable, were now a place of flux, where life was constantly adjusting to the ever-changing conditions. The earth, though uncertain and fragile, was continuing to evolve. The resilience of life, the ability to adapt, to bend with the changing winds and waters, had become the defining characteristic of the planet. The future, though still unknown, was a place where life would continue to rise and fall, adapt and change. The earth had proven that, even in the face of overwhelming challenges, life would find a way forward. The dawn of this new era was not a sign of the end, but of a beginning, a new chapter in the story of the planet and all the life that called it home.